100 years. That's how long she held her breath. Not lungs, those worked fine. It was her blood that had to stay silent. One pulse too bright, one vein too silver, and every vampire in Valanthos would have torn her open just to watch the moonlight pour out. Every evening, before the court stirred from its daytime death, the seamstress called Wren drove a bone needle into her own throat, drew out a single bead of silver-white blood, mixed it with ash, and drank. For another night, her veins ran convincingly red. She was the last of the Ichorborn, beings of primordial creation essence whose blood could make or unmake vampires with a single drop. The species their ancestors had hunted to extinction during the Scarlet Purge. She'd hidden for a century as a mute funeral shroud seamstress 3 levels below the throne room. Invisible. Forgettable. Alive. Then the vibration came through the walls. The king returns. Her only companion, an elderly human servant named Torvin, whispered it through the door crack. King Valdris Sniktern. The dread blood whose fangs could taste truth in any creature's veins. The one vampire she could never let close. And now the head steward was assigning her as his personal seamstress because she was the quietest, the least likely to offend. Her blood began to sing. If you want to know what happens when the vampire king hears her blood singing, when a century of silence shatters in 11 seconds in front of the entire court, then you're going to want to stay for this one. Like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And drop your country in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where in the world this story is finding you tonight. Let's get into it. The ritual began the same way it had for 36,500 nights. Kneel. Needle. Throat. Seraphiel pressed the bone needle into the soft hollow beneath her jaw, angling it with the precision of a century's practice until it found the vein that ran closest to the surface. Not the jugular. Too deep, too dangerous, even for someone who couldn't technically die from blood loss. The thin subcutaneous vessel that carried the brightest concentration of silver. 1 bead. That's all she needed. 1 luminous drop drawn out slowly, carefully, the way a surgeon removes shrapnel, because that's what her own blood had become. Shrapnel. Evidence. A death sentence pooling in a needle's hollow. She mixed it with ash from the palace furnaces. Cold ash, always cold. Warm ash catalyzed the essence instead of suppressing it, and she'd learned that lesson exactly once, in her 11th year of hiding, when her entire chamber had strobed silver for 6 seconds and she'd spent the next 3 hours frozen against the wall waiting for iron gauntlet hands to drag her out. She drank. The taste was extinction. Chalk and silence, and the memory of something luminous being slowly, voluntarily drowned. It coated her throat, settled into her bloodstream, and dimmed. For another night, her veins would run convincingly red. For another night, she was Wren. The rules had become instinct. Never speak. Her voice carried harmonics no human throat could produce. Never bleed where anyone could see. Even the diluted blood sometimes caught light wrong. Never look a vampire in the eye. Her silver-gold irises had no pupils, and no amount of ash could fix that. Eyes down. Mouth shut. Hands busy. She sewed funeral shrouds. 12 hours a night. Black silk threaded with iron filament, stitched in patterns that meant nothing to the vampires who ordered them and everything to her, because the Ichorborn had once been the ones who wove burial rites, and even in hiding, even as Wren, she could not bring herself to sew a death cloth without the old blessings hidden in the seams. Torvin brought her tea at the 3rd bell. He always did. A human servant, 83 years old, lungs thick with a mineral dust that eventually killed every human who lived underground long enough. He set the cup on her workbench with hands that shook worse each month and settled onto the stool he'd claimed as his own decades ago. "You're working too hard, little bird." She shook her head, smiled, pointed at the stack of unfinished shrouds, 6 dead this month. More than usual. Strange times, Torvin murmured and coughed into a cloth she'd sewn for him. The cloth came away spotted. He folded it before she could see, but she always saw. Strange deaths, too. That courier they found in the East Corridor. Did you hear? Drained of something. Not blood. Something else. Physicians can't explain it. She kept her eyes on her needle. Her hands did not tremble. But beneath her sternum, in the space where the Iker heart pulsed its suppressed rhythm, something flickered, a recognition she refused to name. Torvin watched her the way he always watched her, with the gentle, undemanding curiosity of a man who had decided long ago that whatever Ren was hiding, she had earned the right to hide it. He never pressed. He never asked about the scars on her throat, or why she never spoke, or why her hands sometimes moved in patterns that looked less like sewing and more like prayer. He was dying. She knew it the way Icorborn knew all things about the bodies near them, by resonance, by the subtle shift in a living creature's frequency as its systems began to close. 6 months. Maybe less. And when he was gone, she would have no one. Again. Ren. He said it softly. The name that wasn't hers. You know you can tell me anything. She looked at him. Not in the eyes. Never in the eyes. But at the deep lines around his mouth, the paper-thin skin of his temples, the kindness embedded in every crease. She picked up a scrap of silk, and with her needle, stitched 3 words in the old alphabet he couldn't read. I wish I could. She tucked it into his coat pocket when he wasn't looking. The summons came at the 7th bell. The head steward, a mid-rank vampire named Garrus who managed the servant floors with bureaucratic indifference, appeared in her doorway holding a wax-sealed order. The king requires a personal seamstress. Ceremonial armor fittings. Garrus scanned the room, eyes passing over Ren the way they always did, briefly, without interest. You're the quietest. Least likely to offend. Not a compliment. An assessment of disposability. She nodded. What else could she do? But as Garrus left, her blood did something it hadn't done in 11 years. It moved, not through her veins in the normal rhythmic push of circulation, but laterally, toward the walls, toward the ceiling, toward the 3 floors of stone separating her from the throne level. Toward him. As though her own essence had heard something calling it from above and was answering without her permission. She pressed both hands flat against her sternum. Stop. The Iker heart pulsed once, hard, and went quiet. But the direction of that pull, upward, specific, hungry, lingered in her chest like the aftershock of a bell struck too hard. That wasn't normal. Even for her kind, that wasn't normal. The Icorborn resonated with creation, with life, with the essence of living things. They did not resonate with vampires. Vampires were dead. Vampires were the absence of what Icorborn sensed. So why could she feel him? Why, after 100 years of silence, was her blood suddenly singing toward the one creature in Valanthos most capable of hearing it? She picked up her bone needle, threaded it with black silk, and walked toward the door that would take her 3 floors up into the presence of the Vampire King, carrying a century of silence and a body full of light she could no longer fully contain. The guard who escorted her didn't speak. Didn't need to. The route itself was a language, each ascending staircase wider than the last, the rough-hewn servant stone giving way to polished obsidian, the iron ward chains growing thicker, newer, humming with active suppression energy that pressed against Seraphiel's hidden nature like a hand over a screaming mouth. 3 floors up. 3 floors closer to the thing her blood was reaching for. She carried her measuring tools in a leather roll. Bone calipers. Knotted cord marked in precise intervals. A chalk stylus for notation. The tools of Ren, ordinary, human, forgettable. Her hands were steady. A century of practice had made them steady. She could thread a needle during an earthquake, stitch a straight seam while her Iker heart hammered against her ribs like a caged animal smelling open air. The king's chambers were not what she expected. No opulence. No draped silk or gilded mirrors. The room was sparse, almost monastic. Stone walls bare except for deep claw marks near the window that looked deliberate, rhythmic, like something had been counting the years by carving them into rock. A single chair, a weapons rack, and him. Valdris Nictern stood with his back to the door, staring at a map pinned to the far wall with iron nails. He was tall, not the elegant, cultivated tallness of court vampires who held themselves like sculpture. This was the tallness of something that had been standing for 4 centuries and had simply worn the air around it into submission. Pale, but not porcelain pale. Weathered pale. The gray-white of stone that had endured too many storms to bother being beautiful anymore. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that carried its age the way mountains carry snow, not as decoration, but as evidence. He turned. His eyes were deep burgundy, the iris nearly consumed by the black veins that radiated outward from the pupil like cracks in stained glass. The dread blood rot. She'd read about it in texts her people kept before the purge, the slow corruption that ate dreadblood kings from the inside, hollowing them out century by century until nothing remained but hunger, wearing a crown. When those eyes found her, the pupils dilated to full black. And stayed. She dropped her gaze to the floor. Immediately. Instinctively. The way prey goes still when the shadow passes overhead. You're the seamstress. She nodded, kept her eyes on his boots. They were scarred and salt-stained, the boots of someone who had walked through something terrible and hadn't bothered to clean them. She knelt, unrolled her tools, and held up the knotted cord, gesturing toward his arms. May I measure? Look at me, he said. She shook her head, touched her throat, opened her mouth and closed it, the pantomime she'd perfected over decades. Mute. Damaged. Beneath notice. I didn't ask you to speak. His voice dropped. Not louder. Closer, somehow, though he hadn't moved. I asked you to look. She didn't. She rose and reached for his left arm instead, positioning the cord across his shoulder span with professional efficiency. Her fingers brushed the fabric of his sleeve, found the edge of bare skin at his wrist, and silver. The faintest pulse of light beneath her fingertips, there and gone in a fraction of a heartbeat, like a firefly crushed the instant it flared. She snatched her hand back, reached again, pressed the cord against his forearm. Another flicker, briefer this time, but bright enough to leave a ghost impression on her retinas. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. His black eyes tracked each flicker with the patient precision of a predator cataloging a new species. She felt his gaze on her fingers the way you feel a blade held close to the skin, not cutting, not yet, but present in a way that made every nerve scream. She measured his chest span. Silver flickered at both palms. His torso, a pulse at her wrist, the span of his neck, and here, close enough to feel the cold radiating from him, close enough to smell iron and ash and something underneath that was older than both. Her Iker heart gave a single, violent lurch that she covered by dropping the chalk stylus and bending to retrieve it. He let her finish, stood motionless through every measurement, watching her with those ruined eyes, saying nothing about the light that bloomed and died wherever her skin found his. When she rolled the cord, gathered her tools, and turned for the door, she thought, survived. Another performance. Another night. 100 years. His voice caught her between the shoulder blades like a thrown knife. How much of yourself did you bury to last that long? She didn't turn. Her hand found the door frame. Her knuckles went white, human white, not silver, she made sure of that. She walked into the corridor and kept walking, one foot after another, the way she'd walked away from burning cathedrals and silver-stained execution grounds and every place that had ever seen what she really was. Behind her, in the empty chamber, Valdris Nictern stood where the seamstress had left him and pressed his fingers to the place on his wrist where her touch had flared brightest. The skin there was warm, not fever warm, not infection warm, alive warm, in a way that dreadblood flesh hadn't been for 4 centuries. The rot around his sternum, that slow black decay that had been eating him alive since the day he inherited the curse, had stopped spreading. For the first time in 400 years, the boundary of the corruption held still, as though something had told it to wait. He closed his eyes, and there it was. Faint, impossible, a sound he'd last heard in a memory that the Dreadblood elders swore had never existed, a memory of a time before the sundering, before the split, when dark and light were one species, and their blood sang a single, unified harmonic. Her blood sang that harmonic. He opened his eyes. The black had receded slightly from the burgundy. A fraction. A breath's worth. "What are you?" he said to the empty room. But he already knew. The curse knew. The rot knew. Every dead thing inside him that had woken the moment he walked past her door knew. The question wasn't what. The question was how. How had something that was supposed to be extinct survived for a century 3 floors beneath his throne? And why had the Dreadblood curse, which had never responded to anything but hunger and time, just stopped at the touch of a seamstress who bled silverlight? He looked at his wrist again. The warmth was fading. Already he wanted it back. Already the rot was beginning to creep forward again, slower now, reluctant, like a tide that had been shown the moon and couldn't forget the shape of it. He sat in the single chair, pressed his palm to his chest where the black veins were thickest, and waited for the seamstress to come back. He had a feeling she wouldn't have a choice. The delegation arrived at the 9th bell, and the palace changed its posture the way a living thing does when something beautiful and dangerous enters its territory. Seraphiel felt them before she saw them. Not the way she'd felt Valdris. That had been a pull, a gravitational anomaly, specific and directional. This was different. This was pressure. A barometric shift in the essence of the air itself, as though something had entered Valanthos that displaced more space than its physical form should occupy. The iron ward chains in her chamber didn't rattle. They whined, a thin, high-pitched frequency that she felt in her molars. She shouldn't have been in the Great Hall. Shroud seamstresses didn't attend diplomatic receptions. But the head steward had demanded every available servant carry refreshments for the envoy from the court of Pale Meridian, a vampire territory so distant that most of Valanthos considered it semi-mythological. Seraphiel held a tray of crystal goblets filled with something dark and warm that she refused to think about, kept her eyes on the floor, and moved through the crowd like smoke through a keyhole. The ambassador's voice reached her before anything else. Low, melodic, carrying a warmth that no vampire voice should possess. Seraphiel heard courtiers laughing, actually laughing, a sound as rare in Valanthos as sunlight. She heard the clink of gifts being presented, murmurs of admiration, the rustle of bodies gravitating toward a center of gravity that hadn't existed in the room 5 minutes ago. She looked up. Ambassador Lyriel Voss stood at the center of the hall like something painted there by a master who understood that true elegance was a form of predation. Tall, dark-haired, features arranged with the kind of symmetry that didn't occur naturally but had to be composed, each angle deliberate, each proportion calculated to produce trust. She wore deep violet. She smiled at a servant who stumbled, steadying the girl's tray with a gloved hand, and a word so kind it drew a blush. Seraphiel's knees buckled. Not from the beauty, not from the warmth, from the resonance, a deep, tectonic vibration in her chest cavity that hit like a fist wrapped in velvet. Her Iker heart seized. Not the frantic lurch it had given near Valdris. This was worse. This was her own heartbeat played backward, every pulse arriving a half-second before she expected it. The rhythm of her hidden self suddenly syncopated against something that knew the original tempo. She didn't know this woman, had never seen this face, had no memory, no reference, no context for the wave of wrongness that crashed through her suppression like a stone through thin ice. But her blood knew. Her blood screamed, not toward the ambassador the way it had reached for Valdris, but away, recoiling inward, retreating deeper into her core as though trying to hide behind her own spine. The crystal goblets on her tray trembled. She steadied them, set the tray on the nearest surface, walked to the servants' corridor, pressed her back against the cold stone wall and breathed until the resonance dimmed to a manageable roar. What was that? She didn't have an answer. Didn't have a framework for one. The Icorborn were extinct. She was the last. She'd spent 100 years being certain of that, building her entire survival around that certainty the way a cathedral is built around its foundation stone. Remove it, and everything collapses. She returned to her chamber, locked the door, drove the bone needle in, and drank the ash mixture twice, something she hadn't done since the early years, when the suppression was new and unreliable. Her hands shook through both repetitions. The body was found 4 hours later. A minor vampire servant, Kresic, she'd learned his name only because she'd sewn shrouds for his family before. Found in the eastern corridor, slumped against the wall in a position that suggested he'd been standing when it happened and had simply emptied. His blood was intact, his organs untouched, but his eyes were white, not clouded, not filmed, but bleached, as though something had reached through the pupils and drained the color from the inside. His skin had the texture of old paper, the kind that crumbles when you breathe on it too hard. The court physicians declared it an anomaly, a rare blood disease, a curiosity. They brought her the body for shrouding. Seraphiel worked alone, the way she always did. She washed him with ritual efficiency, wrapped the first layer of black silk around his shoulders, and stopped. Her fingers hovered over the skin of his throat, where the faintest shimmer caught the lamplight. Not visible to vampire eyes, not detectable by any instrument the physicians possessed, but to Icorborn senses, to the creation essence awareness she spent every waking moment suppressing. It blazed like a signature written in familiar ink. Icorborn essence. On the corpse. In the corpse, threaded through the emptied spaces where his deeper vitality had been, the way a predator's saliva lingers in the wound it leaves behind. Someone had fed on this vampire the way her kind fed. Not on blood, on essence. On the animating force beneath the blood, the thing that made a vampire more than just a beautiful corpse. The Icorborn had once called it the undertone, the frequency of existence itself, and they were the only species capable of consuming it. But that was impossible. She was the last. She was the last. Her fingers traced the shimmer on Kresic's throat, and the resonance from the great hall returned, that backward heartbeat, that tectonic wrongness, the feeling of her own nature reflected through a mirror that had been shattered and reassembled with pieces missing. She finished the shroud, tied the final knot, pressed her forehead against the dead vampire's cold chest, and listened to the silence where his essence used to be. And in the guest chambers 3 floors above, Ambassador Lyrielvoss sat before a mirror, removed her gloves, and examined hands that flickered, just for a moment, just in the privacy of her own reflection, with a light that was not silver, but the absence of silver. A void shaped like luminescence. A hunger wearing creation's face. She smiled at her reflection. The warmth reached her eyes perfectly. She'd had centuries to practice that. Then she turned from the mirror and looked down through stone, through iron wards, through the suppression barriers that should have hidden everything beneath them. Looked directly at the seamstress quarters. Directly at the last Icorborn kneeling beside a body that still carried traces of her mother's appetite. "There you are," Noctara whispered, wearing Lyriel's mouth. "My darling girl. There you finally are." The announcement came at the first bell, when the court was fullest, and the word would spread like venom through a vein. High Exarch Moravin Threll ascended the dais in the great hall with the mechanical precision of a man who had replaced faith with procedure so long ago that he'd forgotten there was ever a difference. He was gaunt, not the elegant gauntness of vampire aristocracy, but the stripped-down, functional gauntness of a blade that had been sharpened until there was nothing left but edge. His vestments were threaded with iron filament so dense that the fabric moved like chainmail, catching the lamplight with a dull gray sheen that made him look less like a priest and more like a weapon someone had dressed in robes. The iron burned. That was the point. Any vampire whose blood carried impurity, dilution, contamination, deviation from the rigid caste hierarchy the orthodoxy enforced, would blister at the touch of those threads. Morven wore them against bare skin. His neck was a lattice of old scars. Proof, he called it. Purity made visible through suffering. In 3 nights, he said, and his voice carried the flat, compressed authority of a man who had never once doubted himself, the communion of purity will commence. Every soul within Valanthos, noble, common, servant, guest, will drink from the chalice of verification. This is not invitation. This is sacrament. This is law. The chalice sat behind him on the dais, covered in black silk. Seraphiel didn't need to see it to feel it. The iron and bone construction radiated a suppression frequency that pressed against her hidden nature like a thumb against a bruise. The chalice didn't just tuss blood. It announced it. 1 sip, and every molecule of the drinker's essence was broadcast to the room in a pulse of colored light. Red for pure vampire, amber for diluted, and for anything else, for anything the orthodoxy had declared anathema, abomination, extinct for good reason. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. 3 nights. She went back to her chamber and packed. The satchel took less than 4 minutes to fill, and the sight of it, the sum total of a century's existence fitting into a bag she could carry with one hand, hit her with a grief so specific it felt like a medical condition. 1 change of clothes. The bone needle. A scrap of silk Torvin had given her last winter with a clumsy embroidered bird on it that was supposed to be a wren, but looked more like a potato with wings. She'd laughed when he gave it to her. Silently, behind her hand, but she'd laughed. She pressed the scrap to her face, breathed in the smell of human kindness, wool and tea, and the mineral dust that was slowly killing him. Then she shouldered the satchel and walked to the eastern gate. Valdres was already there. He leaned against the archway with the deceptive stillness of something that could move faster than her eyes could track, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to one side in a posture that might have been casual if his eyes weren't black from edge to edge. He'd been waiting. Not minutes. Hours, possibly. Long enough that the iron ward chains nearest to him had warmed and gone quiet, as though even the palace's defenses had decided that arguing with a dreadblood king was an inefficient use of energy. You can't leave. Not a command. A topographical statement, like telling someone the ground is below them. Morven sealed the city at the second bell. Every gate, every tunnel, every crack wide enough to fit a body through. Anyone who refuses the communion is declared impure by default. Impure by default means execution by the iron guard at dawn. She stared at the sealed gate behind him. The iron was new, fresh forged bars driven into ancient stone, still warm from the smithing. She could feel the suppression energy radiating from them in waves. Then I'm dead. The words formed in her throat, pressed against the inside of her closed mouth, and stayed there. She mimed confusion instead. Pointed at the gate. Shrugged. The performance of a mute human servant who didn't understand politics, didn't understand urgency, had simply been out for a walk and found the way blocked. Valdres watched the pantomime with the patience of someone who had spent 4 centuries reading lies in the blood of creatures far more skilled at deception than she was. "Stop," he said quietly. She stopped. "I know what you are, seamstress." The air between them went solid. She felt her suppression flicker, the ash mixture thinning, her silver wanting to surface the way it always wanted to surface, the constant drowning pressure of being not herself suddenly unbearable in the presence of someone who was looking directly at the thing she'd buried. "I've known since the moment I walked through these walls, and every dead thing inside me woke up." He stepped closer. Not predatory, not threatening, the step of a man crossing a distance he'd been measuring for a long time. His hand went to the collar of his shirt, and he pulled it open, not dramatically, not with flourish, but with the grim efficiency of a soldier showing a wound to a medic. The dread blood wrought spread from his sternum like a map of slow catastrophe. Black veins radiating outward in fractal patterns, each one pulsing with a darkness so dense it seemed to absorb the lamplight around it. The corruption had reached his collarbones. Tendrils crept toward his throat. It was eating him. Slowly, methodically, century by century, the way a glacier eats a mountain. By the time you notice, the shape of everything has changed. "This curse has taken everything from me," Valdris said, and his voice carried no self-pity, only the exhausted precision of an inventory long since memorized. "My memories, the first 2 centuries, are gone, eaten from the inside. My mercy, I remember having it the way I remember sunlight. Theoretically, my ability to feel anything but hunger." He paused. The black eyes held hers, held the place where her eyes would be if she'd lift them from the floor. "And then I walked past your door, and felt something I haven't felt in 400 years. The silence stretched. Warmth. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The Iker heart hammered against her ribs with a violence that she was certain he could hear, because dread blood heard everything, sensed everything, and this one, this specific, cursed, slowly dying one, was tuned to her frequency in a way that made hiding feel not just difficult, but cruel. Like holding water from someone dying of thirst. He reached into his coat, produced a vial, small, dark glass, sealed with wax stamped in a symbol she didn't recognize. The liquid inside was the deep arterial red of vampire blood, but it moved wrong. Too uniform. Too perfect. Synthetic. Alchemically forged, he said. It mimics pure vampire blood at the molecular level. Taste, resonance, essence signature, everything the chalice reads. He held it out to her. Not a demand. An offering, extended in a hand that carried the same black rot creeping up his wrist. "This will fool the chalice. Drink it when the time comes." She stared at the vial, at his hand, at the rot that was killing him and the steady, unsentimental way he held the cure for her death while offering nothing for his own.
"Why?"
She mouthed the word without voice.
He read it anyway.
"Because the alternative is watching the last warm thing in this city burn on Morrivan's pyre." He pressed the vial into her palm. His fingers brushed hers. Silver flickered. The rot paused. For one breath, they stood in the sealed gateway, connected by glass and light, and the shared understanding that whatever was happening between them was bigger than survival, older than strategy, and more dangerous than either of them could afford. "Stay," he said. She closed her fingers around the vial.
She stayed.
The palace bled red. Every surface, every column, every archway and balustrade had been draped in crimson silk so deep it looked arterial. The great hall had been transformed into something that was part cathedral, part operating theater. A vast, vaulted space designed to make every creature inside it feel simultaneously exalted and exposed. Candelabras of black iron hung from chains, their flames tinted red by colored glass, casting the entire room in the light of a wound that wouldn't close. And at the center, on a dais of black iron raised 3 steps above the crowd, sat the chalice of verification. Seraphiel had seen it covered. Seeing it uncovered was worse. The chalice was massive, carved, according to Orthodoxy scripture, from a single fang of some primordial beast that predated the vampire species. It was bone-white streaked with dark veins, polished to a sheen that reflected the red light like an eye. It hummed. Not audibly, not for vampire ears. But for Ichor-born senses, still raw and oversensitized from the resonance in the Great Hall 2 nights ago, the chalice broadcast a constant, low-frequency pulse that felt like being watched by something that had no face. She carried a tray. Crystal goblets. Dark wine that smelled like copper and sweetness. She moved through the crowd with the fluid invisibility she'd perfected over a century. Eyes down, shoulders rounded, footsteps timed to fall between the beats of conversation so that no head turned, no gaze snagged, no vampire registered her passage as anything more significant than a change in air current. The vial was in her left palm, hidden beneath the tray's edge. She could feel its weight, negligible physically, catastrophic in every other dimension. Her entire survival compressed into an ounce of dark glass and synthetic blood. "You look frightened, little mouse." The voice came from her right.
Close.
Too close, inside the radius of personal space that Seraphiel maintained with religious discipline, as though the ambassador had simply materialized in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. Lyriel Voss stood beside her, resplendent in deep violet, a goblet held loosely in gloved fingers. The warmth radiated from her like a hearth, that practiced, impossible warmth that made every creature near her lean closer. Her smile was perfect, generous,
Kind.
her gloved hand touched Ren's wrist.
Cold.
Not temperature cold, absence cold. The sensation of something being drawn out through the point of contact. Not blood, not heat, but substance. Essence. The deep animating force beneath the physical, the thing the Icorborn called the undertone. Seraphiel felt it leaving her the way you feel a thread being pulled from a hem. One strand, delicate, almost imperceptible, but if it kept going the entire garment would unravel. She yanked her hand back. The tray wobbled. A goblet slid. She caught it. Lyriel's smile didn't change. Not a millimeter. But her eyes, for a fraction of a second so brief that Seraphiel almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, flashed silver. Not the warm silver gold of Icorborn. The hollow silver of a mirror reflecting a fire that had gone out. "Clumsy," Lyriel said gently. "Be careful tonight, little mouse. The chalice sees everything." She drifted back into the crowd, trailing warmth and violet, and the faintest scent of something Seraphiel recognized from a century ago, from the night of the purge, from the burning cathedral, from the air around her sisters' bodies as they were consumed from the inside out. The scent of Icorborn essence being digested. The communion began. One by one, the vampires of Alanthos approached the dais. Each knelt. Each drank from the chalice, a ceremonial sip, precise and ritualized. And each time, the chalice pulsed red.
Pure.
Verified. Approved. The vampire rose. Morrivan nodded from his position beside the dais like a sentinel carved from disapproval and iron thread, and the next supplicant knelt.
Red. 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 Red.
The line shortened. Servants were called last, an afterthought, a formality, because who suspected the floor scrubbers? Seraphiel stood among them, the vial pressed so tightly in her fist that the glass cut into her palm.
She bled. Human red.
The ash mixture held.
For now.
3 servants ahead of her.
Red. 2. Red. 1. Red.
She knelt. The chalice loomed above her, bone-white and pulsing, and from this close the suppression frequency was unbearable, a pressure against her ichor heart that felt like being crushed in a fist made of silence. Her hands shook. She uncapped the vial beneath the chalice's rim, tipping the synthetic blood into the vessel with a movement so small and so practiced that not even Morrivan's iron-sharpened gaze caught it. She drank. The synthetic blood tasted like nothing. Like the idea of blood described by someone who'd never had a body. It hit her stomach, and she felt it radiate outward, a wave of false resonance, alchemically perfect, molecularly indistinguishable from pure vampire blood. The chalice glowed red. Morrivan nodded. Seraphiel rose.
Turned.
Took 1 step toward the crowd.
1.
2 steps.
2.
3. The chalice screamed. Not metaphorically. The sound erupted from the vessel like something alive and wounded, crystal shattering inside a thunderclap, a frequency so violent it existed beyond hearing, and entered the body through the bones. Every vampire in the hall doubled over. Hands clamped over ears. Goblets shattered on the floor. The red glow of the chalice inverted, red to white, warm to blinding, the light of confirmation becoming the light of exposure, so bright it cast Seraphiel's shadow across the entire length of the hall in crisp, unforgiving detail. The shadow wasn't human-shaped. The chalice cracked. A seam split down its center, through the ancient bone, through the iron dais, through the stone floor beneath, and from the crack, liquid silver poured in a steady, damning stream. Not blood,
not wine.
Moonlight, condensed, concentrated, the essence of what the chalice had found inside the seamstress and could not contain. The silver pooled on the dais. It glowed. It sang, the same harmonic that Seraphiel's blood had been whispering to Valdris through 3 floors of stone, now amplified to a volume that filled the great hall like a bell struck inside a cathedral. Every eye in the room found her. Moravin straightened first. The iron threads in his vestments glowed hot, reacting to the ichor-born resonance the way iron always reacted, with hostility, with recognition, with the memory of what it had been forged to destroy. His gaunt face showed no surprise, no shock, only the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had set a trap so large that anything inside the walls would eventually step into it. His voice cut through the fading scream like a blade through silk. Ichorborn. The word landed on Seraphiel like a physical blow. A century of silence. 100 years of bone needles and ash mixtures and swallowed light and bitten tongues and the slow, daily annihilation of everything she was, undone in 11 seconds by a chalice made from the tooth of a dead god. She stood in the center of the crimson hall, bathed in silver light that poured from the cracked chalice and from her own skin, because the suppression was failing now, the ash mixture overwhelmed, her human mask flickering like a candle in a hurricane. Silver bled through her forearms, her throat, the backs of her hands. Her eyes, she could feel them changing, the manufactured brown irises dissolving, the silver gold rising from beneath like something surfacing from deep water. Every vampire in the hall saw it. Every vampire in the hall knew. And in the back of the room, draped in violet, Ambassador Lyriel Voss raised a gloved hand to her perfect mouth and smiled behind it, a smile that reached her hollow silver eyes completely. 11 seconds. That's how long it took to end a century. Seraphiel had held her breath for 100 years, and the exhale was going to kill her. Moravin's arm rose before the silver stopped pooling. Seize her. The iron guard moved, 12 soldiers in formation, wearing gauntlets forged from melted ichorborn chains, specifically designed during the purge to neutralize creation essence. The iron still carried the faint resonance of her people who had died wearing those chains. Her people's agony smelted into fists. They formed a closing circle. Seraphiel's disguise was failing in waves, silver light bleeding through her skin in patches, each suppression layer collapsing into the next. She was going to die the way her sisters died, surrounded by iron, stripped and burned and unmade. The first gauntlet reached for her shoulder. Valdris moved. 3 strides. The stone floor cracked beneath each one, fractures radiating outward like the ground couldn't bear what was crossing it. His eyes flooded black. His nails extended into obsidian formations. Every shadow in the great hall leaned toward him simultaneously, as though he'd become the gravity source for everything that wasn't light. The iron guard froze mid-stride. Not by choice. Their bodies simply stopped, the command to advance intercepted and rewritten. I invoke the right of sovereign blood. His voice carried a harmonic weight beneath the audible spectrum, a dread blood frequency that didn't enter ears but bloodstreams. The words rewrote intent. The Iron Guard didn't lower their weapons. Their weapons lowered themselves. Moravin's composure cracked. You cannot protect an abomination. The Scarlet Protocols are superseded by my law, my throne, my word. Valdris turned to the hundreds of vampires watching. This woman is under the protection of the crown. She is not a prisoner. She is not a curiosity. His clawed hand reached back. Every survival instinct Seraphiel possessed screamed at her to run, to suppress, to be Wren, be nobody, be the small gray bird no one ever wrote a poem about. She took his hand. Silver met shadow and spiraled, wound around their joined wrists in a double helix, light and darkness weaving into something that looked like a living eclipse. The hall gasped involuntarily. She is mine. Seraphiel's human mask dissolved. Brown leached from her eyes, revealing silver gold beneath, pupilless, luminous, ancient. Her skin shed its manufactured dullness, glowing with soft, relentless moonlight. Her veins surfaced like silver filaments through porcelain. She was beautiful the way an extinction event is beautiful. The way the last of anything is beautiful. With the terrible gravity of something that should not exist but does. She was shaking. Her hand trembled in Valdris's grip. She was exposed, 100 years of hiding stripped away in front of the very creatures her hiding was designed to survive. Every vampire saw her. Every vampire knew her. Morven's mouth worked around words his body wouldn't let him speak. The iron guard stood frozen, gauntlets dimmed. And in the back of the hall, Ambassador Lyriel Voss let her smile show fully.
Wide.
Silver-edged. Far too many teeth. She looked at Seraphiel, glowing, shaking, alive, with hollow silver eyes that reflected the Ichorborn light the way a predator's eyes reflect fire. Mine, Valdris had said. Noctara, behind Lyriel's smile, thought a different word. Finally. The vault of origins existed below everything, below the seamstress quarters, below the foundations, below the geological strata that Valanthos had been carved into. A library entombed in bedrock, its shelves holding texts written on materials that predated paper, predated parchment, predated the vampire species that now claimed ownership of them. The walls were raw stone threaded with mineral veins that pulsed faintly, as though the earth itself had a circulatory system this deep down. No iron wards. No suppression chains. Whatever this place was, it had been built before the orthodoxy existed, and Morven's influence stopped at its threshold like sound stopping at the edge of a vacuum. Valdris sealed the door behind them. Seraphiel stood in the center of the chamber, still glowing, still shaking, the silver gold light pouring from her skin with nowhere to hide. She looked at her own hands, luminous, vein-mapped, alien, and felt the century of suppression sitting in her chest like a collapsed building. She opened her mouth and spoke. You shouldn't have done that. Her voice came out exactly as she'd feared, harmonic, layered, carrying frequencies that no human throat could produce and no vampire ear was built to hear, without consequence. The candle flames on the reading tables flared brighter. The shadows along the walls retreated, pulling back from the sound like tide retreating from a particular shore. And Valdris, 400 years old, Dreadblood King, the most dangerous predator in Valanthos, closed his eyes and breathed. Slowly, deeply. Like a man surfacing from water he'd been drowning in so long he'd forgotten the taste of air. Every vampire in that hall knows what I am now, she continued. The harmonics made the mineral veins in the walls pulse in rhythm with her words. And what you did, claiming an Ichorborn, the orthodoxy will call it treason. It is treason, he said. Eyes still closed. Voice steady. I committed treason the moment I chose to walk past your door instead of through it. He opened his eyes. The black had receded slightly, the burgundy visible again at the edges, as though her voice was doing to his corruption what her touch had done to his wrist. Slowing it, reminding it of something it had forgotten. What I'm about to tell you exists in no text Morven has access to. It's here, he gestured at the ancient shelves, in records the orthodoxy spent centuries trying to destroy. He pulled a stone tablet from the nearest shelf. The script was neither Ichorborn nor vampiric. It was both, Two alphabets interwoven, readable only when both were present. The Dreadblood curse is not a curse. It's a severance wound. He traced the dual script with a rotted finger. Millennia ago, there was one species, one blood. Beings who carried creation and destruction in balance, moonlight and shadow, essence-giving and essence-consuming, the full harmonic. Then the Civil War. The sundering. The Ichorborn kept the light. The Dreadblood kept the dark. He set the tablet down. And both halves have been dying ever since. Your kind, hunted to extinction because the creation essence you carry terrified a species that had forgotten it was supposed to have it. My kind, rotting from the inside, consumed by a hunger that was never meant to exist without the light to balance it. The purge recontextualized in a single breath. Not hatred, not fear. Amputation, a species cutting away its own capacity for creation because the orthodoxy taught them it was contamination. So the mate bond, Seraphiel started, isn't romance. It's biology. Two halves of the same species trying to become whole.
He paused.
The faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Though I won't pretend the romance is entirely absent. She almost smiled. The muscles remembered the motion even after a century of disuse. It felt foreign and fragile and desperately, painfully human, which was strange, because she had never been human at all. The vault door burst open. Torvin collapsed through it. He was bleeding, not from a wound she could see but from everywhere, vitality hemorrhaging from his body like heat from a broken vessel. His eyes were going white. The same bleached, essence-drained white she'd seen on the dead servant. The same paper-thin skin. The same signature of something fed upon at the deepest possible level. She caught him before he hit the stone. Ren, he used the only name he knew. His voice was a whisper wrapped in a death rattle. She touched me. The ambassador. She smiled and she touched me, and I felt everything leaving. His hand found hers. Human fingers, fragile, age-spotted, trembling with the last warmth they would ever hold. He looked at her real face, the silver gold eyes, the luminous skin, the truth he'd never been allowed to see, and his expression held no fear. No confusion. Only recognition. Knew you were special, he breathed. Always knew. He died in her arms. Her silver blood fell on his face. Not tears, not exactly, but the Ichorborn equivalent. Liquid starlight dropping from her eyes onto the weathered, kind, human face of the only person who had treated her like a person in 100 years of hiding. The drops caught in the lines around his mouth. The lines that had formed from decades of smiling at a girl he thought was a war refugee. The lines she had memorized because they were the only map she had to anything resembling home. Deep in her chest, behind her ribs, the Ichor heart changed. Not broke. Not fractured. Ignited. A detonation of creation essence that had nothing to do with acceptance or understanding or the gentle, transformative awakening the ancient texts probably described. This was rage. Pure, luminous, century-compressed rage. The fury of a woman who had buried herself alive to survive and had just watched the only good thing in her grave get murdered by something wearing her mother's hunger. The mineral veins in the vault walls flared silver. The ancient tablets rattled on their shelves. The shadows didn't retreat this time, they fled. And 3 floors above, Noctara felt it. The resonance she'd been hunting for 100 years, finally unshielded, finally unleashed, blazing through the suppression-free depths of the vault like a beacon lit in a world of darkness. The Ichor heart. Awake. Furious. She smiled with Lyriel's mouth one final time. Then she shed the ambassador like dead skin, and descended. She came down through the palace like an inverted dawn. The ambassador's face went first, the warm skin splitting along invisible seams, peeling back from something beneath that was not flesh and not bone but absence. The elegant features of Lyriel Voss folded inward and dissolved, the diplomatic smile collapsing into a geometry that human eyes and vampire eyes alike were never meant to process. What emerged was a silhouette, woman-shaped, Ichor-born-shaped, but filled with stolen light. Hundreds of individual luminescences trapped inside a void, flickering like dying stars caught in a jar of nothing. Each one a consumed child, a devoured sibling, an entire species swallowed from the inside and worn as fuel. The shadow storm followed her like a train. It rolled through Volanthos in waves, darkness that didn't merely block light but ate it, suffocating candle flames mid-burn, devouring the glow of iron ward chains, swallowing the ambient luminescence that vampires relied on the way surface creatures relied on air. In the great hall, vampires screamed. Their borrowed blood, warmed and animated by centuries of feeding, turned to ice in their veins. They collapsed in clusters, clutching their chests, feeling for the first time what it meant to be truly cold. Not temperature, emptiness. The absence of the creation essence they'd never known they carried until something started consuming it. The Iron Guard tried. They formed a line in the eastern corridor, gauntlets raised, iron weapons humming with the suppression energy that had neutralized Ichorborn for centuries. Noctara walked through them. Not around. Through. The iron crumbled at her proximity, not melting, not breaking, but forgetting what it was, the molecular structure unraveling as though the memory of being forged had been eaten from inside the metal. The gauntlets dissolved on the soldiers' hands. Their armor flaked. They stood naked of protection, and Noctara passed between them without looking, because iron only worked on Ichorborn who still carried hope, and she had consumed her own so long ago that the weapons designed to fight her kind couldn't find enough purchase to function. She reached the Vault of Origins. The door didn't stop her. The bedrock didn't stop her. The ancient, pre-orthodoxy protections carved into the threshold recognized what she had once been and hesitation was enough. She flowed through the gap like shadow through a cracked window. Seraphiel was still holding Torvin's body. Valdris stood between them and the door, the dreadblood curse blazing across his chest, obsidian claws extended, every shadow in the vault bending toward him in defensive formation. Noctara raised one hand. The void light inside her pulsed, and from the darkness, chains materialized. Not iron. Corrupted ichor blood, creation essence twisted backward, moonlight curdled into binding, the very substance of Seraphiel's species weaponized against the thing that mirrored it. The chains struck Valdris across the chest and sank in, merging with the dreadblood rot, accelerating it. The black veins exploded outward, across his shoulders, up his throat, consuming the burgundy in his eyes until nothing remained but darkness eating darkness. He dropped to his knees. His claws scraped stone. The sound that came from his throat was not a scream but a frequency, the dreadblood harmonic stripped of control, raw destruction without direction, the sound of a species' dark half being devoured by its own nature. Minutes, Noctara said, observing him the way a physician observes a terminal patient. Perhaps less. The hollow transformation is remarkably efficient once the rot reaches the brainstem. He'll lose language first, then memory. Then hunger becomes everything, and the creature that remains will feed on this city until there's nothing left. She turned to her daughter. Give me the Ichor heart. Willingly. The word willingly landed like a blade. Because Ichorborn essence couldn't be taken by force, not the heart, not the core, not the deepest spark of creation light. It had to be surrendered. A biological safeguard evolved over millennia, the one protection her species carried that couldn't be circumvented by chains or iron or shadow storms. And I will let him disappear slowly, Noctara continued, instead of badly. Seraphiel laid Torvin's body down.
Gently.
The way you lay down something precious that you know you'll never hold again. She stood. The Ichor heart blazed behind her ribs, furious, grieving, awake, and the light pouring from her skin cast Noctara's void form in sharp relief, illuminating every stolen luminescence trapped inside her mother's hollowed silhouette. You ended them all. Her voice, harmonic, layered, terrible, made the ancient tablets on the shelves vibrate. Our family, our species. The purge, the vampires didn't hunt us alone, did they? The realization arrived not as surprise, but as the final piece of a pattern she'd been tracing for a century without knowing it. The guided raids. The impossibly accurate intelligence. The way the purge soldiers always knew exactly where to find them, as though someone had drawn them a map in Ichorborn light. You fed them our locations. In exchange for their essence after the burning. Yes. Noctara's voice carried no shame. Shame required the capacity for self-reflection, and she had consumed that along with everything else. Every sister, every elder, every child who still glowed bright enough to be worth harvesting. I fed the purge their coordinates, and when the iron did its work, I collected what remained. She stepped closer. The stolen lights inside her shifted, faces almost visible in the swirl, mouths open in silent screams that would never end because the consciousness behind them was still present, still aware, still trapped inside the thing that had eaten them. I am the last god of our kind, Seraphiel. I will be the only god. I need only the heart you carry, the last spark of uncorrupted creation, and the transformation completes. Undeath perfected. Shadow made permanent. Her void form expanded slightly, the darkness around her deepening. A world where the sun itself forgets to rise. Behind her, Valdris convulsed. The rot reached his jaw. His mouth opened and closed around words that were already dissolving into growls. Minutes. Perhaps less. And Seraphiel stood between her dying king and her undying mother, the ichor heart blazing with a rage that had nowhere to go except into the choice Noctara had engineered from the beginning: surrender or watch everything burn. Two choices. Noctara had engineered them perfectly, the way a mother who had spent centuries devouring her own children would engineer anything, with surgical cruelty and absolute knowledge of the anatomy she was cutting. Surrender the ichor heart. Save Valdris. Let the world go dark forever. Or keep it. Watch him become a hollow. Fight Noctara alone. Incomplete, severed. One half of a species trying to wield a whole species' power. Lose. Seraphiel looked at Valdris. The rot had consumed his throat. His jaw worked around sounds that were no longer language. Guttural. Raw. The dreadblood harmonic stripped to its most primitive frequency. Hunger without memory. Destruction without direction. He was disappearing. The man who had walked past her door and chosen not to walk through it. The king who had committed treason for warmth. He was being eaten by his own darkness, and the chains of corrupted ichor blood sank deeper with every heartbeat, feeding his curse back to him like poison recycled through a closed system. She looked at Noctara. At the void wearing her mother's shape. At the hundreds of stolen luminescences flickering inside that hollow silhouette, her sisters, her father, every Ichorborn who had trusted the wrong person and been consumed for it. She looked at Torvin's body on the stone floor. The kind face, the still hands. She chose neither. She opened her mouth. Not to speak. Not to form words or arguments or pleas. She opened her mouth and released the thing she had been suffocating for 100 years, the Ichorborn harmonic. The original frequency. The sound that existed before language fractured it into syllables, before blood divided it into species, before the sundering split creation from destruction, and taught both halves that they were enemies. It was not a scream. It was not a song. It was the sound of being, pure, unfiltered existence expressed as vibration, the frequency at which matter remembers it was once energy, and energy remembers it was once light. It poured from her throat like a river breaking through a dam that had held for a century, and it filled the vault of origins the way dawn fills a room. Not gradually, but absolutely. Not illuminating the darkness, but reminding the darkness that it had once been something else. Every illusion in Valanthos shattered simultaneously. 3 floors above, glamours dissolved on vampire faces. Suppression wards flickered and failed. The shadow storm stuttered, Noctara's consuming darkness hiccuping as though something fundamental in its architecture had been questioned and couldn't find the answer. The corrupted chains on Valdris cracked. Not because the sound was powerful enough to break them, because the sound was true enough to remind them. Ichor blood. Even twisted, even weaponized, even curdled into binding by a mother who had forgotten what creation meant, was still Ichor blood. And the harmonic spoke to it in its original language. Remember. Remember what you were before she broke you. Remember what you were before the sundering. Remember. The chains remembered. And they let go. Valdris gasped. The rot froze, mid-spread, mid-consumption, the black veins halting as though the curse itself had heard something it recognized. His eyes cleared. Not fully. The darkness remained, would always remain, because it was not disease but identity, but the burgundy returned at the edges, and with it, comprehension. Language. Self. He looked at Seraphiel across the vault. She blazed with creation light, the ichor heart fully unleashed for the first time in her existence, silver pouring from her skin like moonlight given a body. He looked at her, and the dread blood darkness inside him didn't recoil. It responded. For the first time, they didn't fight the bond. Seraphiel let the ichor heart detonate outward, not surrendering it, not handing it to the void that had birthed her, but sharing it. Pouring creation light into the world without restraint, without suppression, without the bone needle and the ash mixture and the century of self-inflicted silence. Valdris let the dread blood dark surge to meet it, not consuming the light the way the sundering had taught his kind to consume, but weaving with it. Shadow and silver spiraling into a double helix that rose from their joined hands like a living thing, like DNA, like the original code of a species that had been split in half and had spent millennia forgetting it was ever whole. The convergence hit Noctara first. She screamed, not in pain, in loss. Because the combined power of creation and destruction reunited didn't attack her. It purified her. The double helix passed through her void form like light through glass, and everywhere it touched, stolen essence was released. The consumed children peeled away from her interior, luminescences separating, individualizing, each stolen light remembering its own name before dissolving into the air, with the soft finality of breath returning to atmosphere. Her sisters, her elders, her children. Layer by layer, century by century, the parasitic architecture of her godhood was disassembled, not with violence, but with recognition. Each stolen piece acknowledged, mourned, and freed. What remained was small. A woman. Old beyond counting. Ichorborn, but barely. The faintest silver glow clinging to skin that had forgotten how to generate its own light. She collapsed onto the stone floor, mortal, diminished, emptied of everything she had consumed, and filled with nothing but the memory of what it cost. Silver tears tracked down a face that looked, for the first time in centuries, like a face instead of a mask. She wept, not for power lost, for the children she remembered loving, before she decided to eat them. The convergence didn't stop at the vault. It rippled outward, through stone, through iron, through every suppression ward and caste barrier and architectural cruelty the orthodoxy had embedded in the bones of Valanthos. It moved through the palace like a pulse through a body, and everywhere it passed, things changed. Blood caste markers dissolved. The rigid molecular signatures that separated pure blood from common, that elevated some vampires and diminished others based on ancestry rather than character, they softened, blurred, merged into something more fluid. Purebloods felt hierarchies loosen in their veins like fists unclenching. Common vampires felt strength they'd never been permitted to access, rising from depths they'd been taught didn't exist. The iron wards in the city walls, centuries old, specifically forged to repel Ichorborn essence, began to glow. Not with suppression heat, with transformation. The metal softened, flowed, reformed. Where there had been barriers, archways appeared. Where there had been walls, there were doors. Open, welcoming. The architecture of exclusion becoming the architecture of invitation. 3 floors above the vault, in the great hall still draped in crimson silk, High Exarch Moravin Thrall felt his vestments crumble. The iron threads disintegrated, not melting, not breaking, but simply ceasing to hold their shape, the suppression energy that had defined them evaporating like frost in unexpected warmth. The fabric fell from his body in gray dust. His scars remained, the lattice of self-inflicted burns across his neck and chest, but the symbols that had given those scars meaning were gone. He stood in the center of the Orthodoxy's greatest hall, stripped of rank, stripped of authority, stripped of the theological framework that had allowed him to declare who was pure and who was abomination. For the first time in his long existence, he was simply a vampire. No better and no worse than any other creature standing in the changed air of a changed city.
He looked at his bare hands and sat down.
In the vault, Seraphiel and Valdris stood at the center of everything, hands still clasped, the double helix still spiraling between their joined fingers, slower now, settling, the initial detonation resolving into a steady, sustainable frequency that felt less like an explosion and more like a heartbeat. They were not 2 halves made whole. That was the old story, the sundering narrative, the myth that wholeness required fusion. They were 2 complete beings whose completeness was amplified by proximity, creation and destruction not merged but harmonized, each making the other more fully itself. In Seraphiel's chest, where the ichor heart had blazed with rage and grief and a century of suppressed existence, something new was beating.
Steady, warm, shared.
She could feel it echoed in Valdris's chest, his dreadblood core, no longer rotting, pulsing with a darkness that was no longer decay but purpose. 2 hearts. 1 frequency. She looked at him. Silver gold eyes, pupilless, unhidden, unashamed. He looked at her. Burgundy and black, the rot transformed into veins of dark intention laced with threads of silver. Neither of them spoke. The harmonic said everything. 3 months later, Valanthos opened new passages to the surface, not to the sun, but to the moonlight, which fell differently now. Warmer, silver-tinged, as if the sky remembered. The crimson orthodoxy dissolved. The covenant of dusk and dawn took its place, a council of Ichor-born descendants who discovered latent heritage after the convergence, reformed dreadblood, and common vampires governing together for the first time. Moravin served as archivist, a penance he chose himself. Noctara lived in a small room at the palace's base. She did not rule. She did not scheme. She sewed. Seraphiel had taught her. They didn't speak often, but sometimes Seraphiel brought thread, and they sat in the same silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of 2 people who didn't yet have words for what needed to be said. The first convergence children were born, vampire young whose blood shifted between silver and red depending on the light, carrying creation and destruction in balance, who would never know the sundering as anything but history. Seraphiel sat on a throne rebuilt from the melted chains of the Scarlet Purge. She did not hide. When she spoke, her harmonic voice filled the court with warmth, and no one flinched. Valdris, dreadblood veins traced with silver now. The rot healed, the curse transformed into something that looked like purpose, reached for her hand. "You held your breath for 100 years, he said quietly. "Yes." "How does it feel to exhale?" She looked out over the court, over the covenant, over the world learning, slowly, painfully, beautifully, to be whole. "Like waking up," she said. "One more thing. In the seamstress quarters, 3 levels below, a glass case sits on the workbench where Wren used to sew. Inside it, a bone needle and a scrap of black funeral shroud stained with a single drop of silver. The plaque reads, She hid here for 100 years. Not because she was weak, but because surviving is its own kind of strength. And sometimes the bravest thing a monster can do is stop pretending to be human. Visitors leave flowers. Common vampires, purebloods, convergence children. They come to the tiny room and stand in the silence Ren kept for a century. And if they listen closely, really closely, with the blood sense all vampires share, they can still hear it.
Faint. Silver.
Eternal. The blood that sings.